And today we have a special guest. This is somebody from, South Africa. Really excited to be talking to Hermann today, who runs the Twitter channel called Bitcoin EKASI. How are you doing, Hermann?
I'm doing very well yourself. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you as well. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Maybe we can start where we always start, introductions, who you are, what you do, how you got into the, Bitcoin space as well.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, my name is Hermann. I run the Twitter profile Bitcoin EKASI. I also manage the project. My journey to Bitcoin basically started as a result of international sanctions. We run a business, my wife and I, a tourism business, and it was in 2013. We had some clients from Russia, and some of them were based in Cyprus, and they were banking. There was a banking crisis in Cyprus at that time. Basically, deposits over, I think it was 150,000 euros or 200,000 euros, were a certain percentage of those deposits were confiscated as a result of that banking crisis. Yeah, that got me thinking about how, the problem of custody. So you trust the bank with your money. That's the kind of thing that can happen. I'd never really thought about it until then, but that got me thinking. And then at the same time, a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, introduced me to this thing called Bitcoin. He wasn't 100% sure how it worked or what it was, but he gave me a copy of Bitcoin magazine. And I just started reading that, and from there just became fascinated with it. I learned as much as I could. I bought it the wrong time in 2013, so I bought right at the top of the almost at the top, near the top of the 2013 bull market. I fortunately never sold through 2014, 15 or 16. I held on to it. So, but for the first 2 years, that was quite a painful experience. So yeah, that's more or less it.
All right. Okay, great. Yeah, but when you look back, I think you made the right decision, no doubt.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's quite common to learn the most valuable things when you experience a certain amount of suffering. It's suffering that teaches life's most valuable lessons. And those first 2 years, I kind of had to, I basically had two choices. I could either sell at a loss, or I could learn to understand what this thing was, how it worked, and why it's valuable, so that I could justify to myself and to my wife why I don't get rid of this stuff. So I chose the second option, and I absorbed as much as I could within those first couple of years, and fortunately decided to hold on to it. Yeah.
So thanks for that background. It's always amazing about how people always get into crypto, and I think that's why the community is so vibrant, because of the reasons why people got in the first place. And so now, Hermann, you are now based in South Africa. Where are you currently based?
We're in a small town called Mossel Bay. So Mossel Bay is it's a town of about 100,000 people. So not a big city at all. Driving from Cape Town, it would take you about 4 hours to get here. It's towards the east of Cape Town. So it's about 400 kilometers from Cape Town. Most people outside South Africa wouldn't know where Mossel Bay is, but it's in the vicinity of Cape Town. Cape Town is the nearest big city.
4 hours away. Wow.
Yeah, 4 hours. It's about 300, and it's between 300 and 400 kilometers, depending on how you drive.
Okay.
So it's not too far.
South Africa as a country and as an economy, do you mind giving us a glimpse for some of us who are not in South Africa? How what's the state of the economy right now?
Look, I'm by no means an economic expert. I focus on the little the little project that we're running, but broadly speaking, I think I think the economy has been struggling for some time. Even prior to COVID, the economy wasn't growing particularly fast. Economic growth was, I think the word they used was subdued prior to COVID, and then obviously, you know, with the COVID lockdowns and stuff, even more so. I know that the country, the national government is now more indebted than it's ever been before. So the previous highest debt level was somewhere in the 1960s, and the government has now crossed that threshold. So government debt is at an all-time high. Obviously, like most other countries, the government had all kinds of stimulus programs to try and get the economy going again. Overall, I'd say the economic outlook in South Africa, you know, my limited knowledge, it's not particularly positive, but it's not entirely bleak either. Our business is, other than the Bitcoin program we run, our other business is mostly based in tourism, and I think tourism was one of the fastest growing sectors in the economy. Unfortunately, that obviously got hit really hard by COVID. So tourism, international tourism has struggled to recover. Yeah, I think other than that, the major economic sectors like agriculture and mining, again, I don't think they're doing particularly well, but then they're not, it's looking a lot better than what it is in a lot of other countries, I suppose. But I'm by no means an expert, so
yeah. I mean, thanks for that outlook. I think it's always good for our listeners to just understand, you know, just the state of the economy, and just to understand where, you know, we are coming from. And, you know, along those lines also, Hermann, maybe do you mind also giving us an idea of how the crypto space looks like when it comes to regulation? As we you know, we've seen some countries in Africa ban crypto, others are very heavily restricted. There are capital controls. How does the regulation look like in South Africa?
For the time being, it's quite friendly. So there's a lot of startups in the cryptocurrency and Bitcoin space. There has unfortunately been some really big scams coming out of South Africa. I think two of the biggest scams originated here. One of them was called MTI, the other one was AfriCrypt. And those guys unfortunately stole a lot of money. So people are quite skeptical towards cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. And so there's been more calls for the space to be more heavily regulated. So there are plans to introduce new regulations, and there has been regulations passed more recently. So yeah, it is becoming more regulated, but I don't think that the regulation so far anyway has been negative towards the underlying technology. So I think regulators are trying to wrap their heads around it and trying to understand how to regulate it, but it's definitely not a case where Bitcoin and cryptocurrency won't be banned in South Africa. So it's also probably not going to be made legal tender anytime soon. That's very unlikely to happen. South Africa historically has always had very strict capital controls. So it's been difficult to take money out of the country. A very sort of conservative banking sector. Banks are very strictly regulated. Yeah, I think it's generally quite positive. Yeah, I think generally quite positive in terms of regulation. I mean, obviously, from my perspective, I'd always prefer less regulation, because the kind of communities we work with, regulation doesn't really do anything good there. It only keeps people away from basic services. We've seen that in the banking industry, where it's been really difficult to open bank accounts for some of the people we work with. So yeah.
Thank you. I mean, and just talking about your initiatives, just jumping right in, you know, you run an initiative called Bitcoin EKASI. I know You've been doing a lot of education in that space. Maybe break down to us what these initiatives are. And even before you start that, Bitcoin EKASI, where did that name come from? Like what does it mean? Give us a bit of background on that.
Okay, cool, man. Well, EKASI is a word that was originally the word in Afrikaans is lukasi, and it's a word that refers to the poor slums that started growing outside South Africa's big economic hubs, like the big cities where people would come to look for work. And this was during the previous regime in apartheid, where the city centers were reserved for white people only, and everybody else had to live outside. And it was the infamous Group Areas Act, which forced certain people to live in certain areas. And so what would happen was Africans would come looking for work in the cities, but then because of the laws, they were forced to live outside the city. They could work in the city, but they were forced to live outside. And so these big slums grew outside the cities, and these areas started being referred to as the lukasi, which is an Afrikaans word. Afrikaans is a Europe. It's essentially a European language. It's mostly Dutch, about 70% Dutch, and the white apartheid government used Afrikaans for the most part. It's also my mother language. But then that word was taken and it was sort of adopted, and even today, the word EKASI, derived from that word, refers to these areas, but it's got a slightly adapted meaning in the sense that an EKASI is one of these locations. We call them townships in English. It's one of these locations where you also find a very vibrant life in the streets. So people would cook food outside on the street, and life happens outside on the street, so there's normally quite a vibe. So that's generally where the word comes from, and that's obviously the reason why we call our project Bitcoin EKASI, is because we are based in one of these townships. So the township we are based in it's a very poor area. Upwards of 90% of the people who live there are from other parts of the country. They come here looking for work. Mossel Bay is not a very big town, but still it's got an industrial part where there are factories and production and so on. There's a big liquid gas to petroleum refinery outside Mossel Bay. So a lot of people come looking here for work, and inevitably the poor people end up living in these slums. So we are based in one of these townships. That's the name, Bitcoin EKASI. And basically what we want to do is we want to take the Bitcoin Beach example from El Salvador, and we want to implement it here, and we want to move that township where we are based onto a Bitcoin standard. El Salvador, Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador, they saw really big improvements in the community when they introduced the Bitcoin standard, because Bitcoin essentially gave people in that community the opportunity to save for the future for the first time. And there's this idea that people who don't earn a lot of money are not interested in saving, but that's only because people who don't earn that well have never really had the opportunity to save, because to save means to invest. If you want to save money, you've got to invest your money in something. There's no point putting your cash in a shoebox and stuffing it under your bed. So when poor people are given the opportunity to save for the future, it also changes the way of thinking. This is what happened in El Zonte with Bitcoin Beach anyway. And so we are curious to see whether the same thing can happen here. If we introduce Bitcoin into one of these communities, will they adopt it? And if they adopt it, could it be of benefit to them? And could it be a tool with which they can uplift themselves and change their lives for the better? Because there is a lot of poverty and a lot of people living in very difficult circumstances in some of these townships. And we are only focused on a very, very small township, but we're hoping that it could be an example for other people to follow. Just as Bitcoin Beach was an example for us to follow. I mean, We're basically copy pasting what they did.
Thank you for that breakdown. Actually, a lot of history I didn't know about the townships in South Africa. I think that gives us very good context of where you're coming from and Bitcoin EKASI's initiative. Maybe also at this point, Hermann, could I ask, what's the progress of this project? I've seen you posting pictures of actual buildings you're building, educational centers, I suppose. Would you mind giving us a bit of a deep dive into how you're going about this and the progress so far that you've seen from these initiatives?
Yeah, sure thing. I think first of all, it's worth mentioning that we started Bitcoin EKASI in August 2021, so about 7 months ago. But we are using an existing organization as a platform. And the organization that we are using is called the Surfer Kids. It's a registered nonprofit that's been running for 10 years. So we have an existing platform in the township community. So it's not the first time. Bitcoin EKASI is not the first time that we are moving into this township. We've been there for many years. So we have an existing relationship with the people who live there. The coaches that work for us, who also live in the township, have been working for us for several years. So it's a new project, but our presence in the township is not new. In terms of how far we've progressed with Bitcoin EKASI itself, we have 5 shops in the township that accept Bitcoin as payments. These shops sell basic groceries, very, very basic. So these are the types of shops that people would run out of a container. So it's informal. These are not big supermarkets. And we have 3 junior coaches, 1 senior coach, 2 high school kids, and from this week onwards, we'll have 2 lifeguards. So that's a total of 3 plus 5, 6, 8 people earning salaries on a weekly basis in Bitcoin. The rough total of what they're earning in Bitcoin it's approximately 4,000 Rand. Not sure what the conversion rate on that would be. That's approximately $300 per week. That's all being paid in Bitcoin, and I'd say about 80% of that is being spent at those 5 shops on a weekly basis. The shop owners are holding on to most of that. They are not converting out of Bitcoin for now. They see that as an investment opportunity for them. It's a small part of their turnover, so they don't need to convert yet. Obviously, if more people start using Bitcoin, they would have to convert something to buy stock. Unless we can get their suppliers onto a Bitcoin standard too. In terms of the education center, this is something we've been working on since January. It's basically just a place where we want to have a presence so that people in the community who are interested in Bitcoin can come and learn about it. So for the past 10 years, we've been operating in the township, recruiting children into our nonprofit and teaching them surfing as a means to empowerment. But our presence has always been on the beach. And so the beach is very close to the township, but it is about a 20-minute walk. And so if shop owners are interested to learn about Bitcoin, they're not going to walk down to the beach. We need something in the township that's within easy reach of them. So this is basically what the education center is, just to spread knowledge of Bitcoin in the township, because obviously we can't expect people to use this thing if they don't understand what it is. And if there are problems, there has to be somebody there that can help them sort it out, especially in the beginning.
Talking about education, thanks for that. Thanks for actually those initiatives that actually, are helping in terms of adoption. I know education is not easy. We do that all the time. There are challenges. We have certain experiences. Do you mind, just helping us understand some of the challenges that you have to face when it comes to education? and possibly what you see as rewards if, you know, this thing actually becomes successful and becomes like a Bitcoin beach. You know, those challenges possibly where you feel, you know, more can be done, and possibly how this would look like, you know, in your opinion, if this thing actually becomes successful as you'd like it to.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is the fact that the majority of people who we first try and introduce to Bitcoin thinks it's a scam. That's the initial reaction. I think even more so amongst poorer communities like the one where we are operating, because unfortunately, historically, the poorer communities in South Africa has been deprived of education. So the level of education, general education, in these communities is very low. And that's
do you mind maybe giving us an idea of the level of education, or like just a percentage of, you know, how many people are actually educated
in that particular area where we're operating? It's very unusual to see a person attain a tertiary education. So generally children would finish primary school, which is up to grade 7, and then for the most part they would finish high school. But it's also quite common for children to drop out before finishing high school. But almost no one goes on to get a university education. It's less than 3%, less than 2% of the people from that community that would go on. University education in South Africa is incredibly expensive, and there is no free university education. School education is free, basic education is free, but because of South Africa's situation, in terms of high levels of unemployment, a shrinking tax base, government schools are unfortunately underfunded. So the schools in the poorer areas tend to suffer the most because they do not have a base of parents to draw from. So in terms of extra fundraising or contributions made by parents, the schools in the poorer areas struggle the most. So there's too many children and not enough teachers. The schools are just generally not well equipped in terms of supplies and stuff. So education is a massive problem, and unfortunately the South African government's response has been, to a large extent, to try and tackle the problem. They would lower the levels required to attain a qualification to finish school, rather than try and lift the levels up to increase the number of people who get the school education. They would just lower the levels, which would push the pass rate up, but doesn't really fix the problem. So yeah, so we're sitting with a very, very high level of not well educated people in the poorer areas. And I mean, that's understandable. It's a very difficult problem to solve, obviously. It's not an easy problem to tackle. And so it's normally in these areas where scams are most prolific. So scammers would target these people first because it's easier. Well, first of all, they're more desperate, and when a person is more desperate, they're more likely to fall for something that promises them a free lunch. And second of all, it's easier to convince somebody to buy into something that they don't understand. If your degree of financial literacy is higher, then you can easily figure out that an annual return of 150% is just not realistic. So anybody that promises you something like that is obviously doing something that they shouldn't be doing. But yeah, these people are the ones that get targeted first, and so the scams do the most harm in some of the poorest communities. So that's probably the biggest challenge we face. We have made contact with all the shop owners in the township where we operate, but so far we've only got 5 on board, because those are the only 5 that were willing to to cooperate with us. The rest of them, for now, think that Bitcoin is still a scam. It's not that we are not in touch with him. So that's going to be tricky, and the only way to address that, I think, is through demonstration, really. I mean, which is a form of education. So we would basically just demonstrate that, look, we can buy mobile credits using Bitcoin. We can buy pizza from the local pizza restaurant using Bitcoin, or whatever. And in doing that, they all sort of, come around and, okay, probably Vodacom would not accept Bitcoin as payment for mobile credits if it was a scam. So this is what we're busy with for the most part.
All right, great. That's quite a lot of work, and I think that requires quite a lot of resources to undertake. Are you working with partners? Are you looking for partnerships to help you achieve these goals, or how do you intend to go?
Our project Bitcoin EKASI, as I mentioned earlier, is basically an extension of the Surfkids non-profit, and that's been a donation-based non-profit for the last 10 years. So essentially what we've done is we've moved with Bitcoin EKASI, we've moved the entire non-profit almost onto a Bitcoin standard, because we are now taking donations in Bitcoin rather than in fiat, whereas before we were taking donations in fiat. And we are covering one of our largest expenses with Bitcoin, which is salaries. So yes, we are asking for donations on Twitter and wherever else we can. And the idea is that by donating Bitcoin, you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. So before, where a fiat donation would only really accomplish one thing, which is to cover the salaries of the coaches running the organization, a donation in Bitcoin does two things. It covers the salary of the coaches running the organization, plus it builds this example of Bitcoin adoption in a community that can really benefit from it, because the Bitcoin donation is not converted to fiat. So whatever donations we take in Bitcoin is used as Bitcoin to pay the salaries of the coaches. And they also don't convert to fiat, because they go to the shops in the township and use that Bitcoin to buy their groceries from the shops. So, and hopefully soon those shops will also use that Bitcoin as Bitcoin rather than convert it. They are still converting some of it, obviously, because it's still early days. But ideally, in within the next year or so, maybe sooner, we would be able to onboard some of their suppliers. So the suppliers where they buy their stock from onto Bitcoin, and they can actually take that Bitcoin and use it to buy stock without converting to fiat. This is more or less what happened with Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador, and we basically just, following the same path. We are in direct communication with Bitcoin Beach, and we are taking what worked for them and trying to implement it here, adjusting it where necessary. We do receive support from Bitcoin Beach as well. They would like to see what we do succeed, because it'll illustrate that this can happen anywhere. If this can be done in El Zonte, in El Salvador, and it can be replicated on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in Africa, then it can happen anywhere. And if it can happen anywhere, then that's great, because that's ultimately what we want. We want to move the whole world onto a Bitcoin standard.
Indeed. I mean, it's impressive, actually, what you've done. I would almost add, we would like to see a Bitcoin Beach, across other different countries on the continent, because I think really that's what we really need. I think, thank you for those lessons. I think they would come in really handy for anybody else who wants to implement a Bitcoin Beach somewhere else on the continent. And as we close, Hermann, maybe if I may ask, from the lessons that you've learned and from all the work that you've done with Bitcoin EKASI, what sage advice would you give to anybody who's trying to do what you're doing, or who is really attempting to deliver, offer Bitcoin education anywhere across Africa or even beyond? What would be that sage advice?
I mean, first of all, yes, I would love to see more examples of this and of what Bitcoin Beach did in as many places as possible. There is one or two examples happening in other parts of Africa. There's one in Senegal. I think they're called Kive and Claire or something like that. There's a couple of other examples happening in Central America and in South America. There's one in Guatemala, in Costa Rica, in Brazil. And I would love to see this spread throughout the less developed part of the world. I think Bitcoin is a fantastic tool for economic empowerment, particularly for people in underdeveloped parts of the world where financial inclusion is not necessarily so great. Words of advice, I don't know. I mean, I would say just get going, you know. I think one has to find, like what we did, we took what we were already busy with and translated that into a way to spread Bitcoin adoption. And I think that's probably the best advice I could give anyone, is to take what you're already good at and to translate that into a way that can help spread Bitcoin adoption. You know, for people who are good at writing or making music or whatever, you know, don't try to start from scratch, but rather try and take what you're already busy with and convert that into something. And so that's basically just what we did. You know, we've been running this organization for the last 10 years, and then basically just converted the organization into something that can still do what it was doing, but in addition to that also spread Bitcoin adoption. You know, people who run small businesses can do the same thing. You know, they can, if you're passionate about Bitcoin, then you can encourage your customers to start paying in Bitcoin. You know, I don't know. I think that's probably the best advice I could give. And start small and keep it simple.
Great advice, Hermann. Now, for people who want to learn more about Bitcoin EKASI, what you're doing, for maybe even, you know, organizations that want to partner with you or that want to donate, you know, to help the cause, how can they do that?
We've got a website. The website is bitcoin-bay.org. Unfortunately, our original domain name, which was bitcoinekasi.com, is not quite functional at the moment. We are trying to fix that. But in the interim, people can use Bitcoin Bay, bitcoin-bay.org. Otherwise, find us on Twitter, which is at bitcoinekasi.
Yeah, so I encourage people to really support your effort. And thank you so much, Hermann, as well, for talking to us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.